Hello everybody, this is Joshua Phillips for Living Reason. You can catch me here or at facebook.com/Living Reason. Please like, share, subscribe, spread this around if you like my videos. Today's video is technically a reply to my friend James Ellias on the video Ayn Rand's Scientific Approach to Ethics. The good news for you, the viewer, this video is basically freestanding. If you want to go check out his video, it'll be down below. But you should be able to understand this whether or not you're up for another video today. So to dive right in, the video from James discusses the meta-ethical/ethical approach of Ayn Rand to ethics, particularly how she attempted to overcome some of the problems faced by ethical systems. So I think there were some very good points in this video to start with. Number one, ethical theories very plausibly have to have a scientific, that is factual in this context, basis to explain what the ethical theories are about and why they are true. They can't just be statements that are somehow magically true, because that would require this very weird sort of grounding. A broader topic for another video. Secondly, from this video, as James identifies, sort of well-being or flourishing or happiness in the broadest sense, some different terms for it, is obviously one of the best candidates within the context of ethics for what ethics should have as its goal. So you have this idea that human flourishing or flourishing in general or individual happiness, these all sound like very good plausible candidates for an ethical theory for a few reasons. For instance, they intuitively sound good, which is not proof but is at least not contrary to proof. Secondly, they are measurable in a qualitative sense, at least subjectively. They're also coherent, and it's clearly not an appeal to some mystical idea, right? If I say that I'm happy, I mean a particular thing in reality. I don't just mean there's this mysterious notion of happiness that is being fulfilled. I am talking about a thing in the world. So that's good. Thirdly in the video, and this is the part that comes from Rand to some extent, James in this video correctly identifies, I think, why most ethical theories fail very frequently to make sense or to be provable or to not be arbitrary ideas. So I'm going to generalize a little bit more broadly than he did. He suggested that the two sort of common errors are: an ethical theory takes a few particular ideas, like everyone being happy is good, not lighting things on fire is good, and tries to take this list and then form it into an ethical theory. So you take sort of the intuitive guesses at certain events, whether they're good or bad, and try and add them up into an idea. The other direction is to start with some broad principle like justice or freedom or equality or truth or beauty. These are sort of the ones I recall being used, and take from that theory and sort of stretch it out to cover every sphere of decision-making. So for instance, if you start with the idea that ethics is about acting for the sake of justice, you might try and extrapolate, well, what would that mean in the context of, what kind of political system we should have, or how does that mean I should treat people? And what James identifies in this video, and coming from Rand, what he identifies is that many of these ethical systems have this small problem, which is that there's an intuitive basis for them. The idea of justice sounds very good. The idea of freedom sounds very good. Or from the other direction, certain things like being nice to children, not stealing, not lighting things on fire. But we have judgments about these things ethically that we want to build into a system. The problem they run into is that if someone just asks or says, I don't agree with you, or why should I go along with your view of ethics, then they have this fundamental justification problem. Now, this is an extremely broad topic. I'm not claiming to have, fully fleshed out why other ethical theories fail at this. But I think this is, in a very brief form, an accurate statement of what's wrong with most ethical theories, is that they take some principle, or they take the sum of a few particular judgments, and they accept this as the axiom of their ethical system, because it sounds good, it's intuitively nice, something like that. And it runs into this sort of inevitable problem of either You get contradictions, perhaps, because you have different intuitions that are not compatible with each other in every context. Or you realize that your principle is very hotly debatable. Classically, there are quite a few different factions who think, for instance, that well-being is the most important thing, but then disagree about what sort of things count as well-being, how you should add up different kinds of well-being, like sort of carnal happiness versus artistic appreciation. And the area that problem comes from is that they haven't explained why this principle is the principle of ethics. And so, coming from Rand in this, I think the very good observation is that to make an ethical theory work, you have to back up a step from trying to justify a particular ethical idea and ask, what are ethical theories trying to accomplish? So my view on this is that ethical theories are trying to explain how and why you should make decisions when you perceive options between different actions you could take. So, if you see a burning building and realize there are people screaming on the second floor, in some sense, ethics in this sort of extreme situation is supposed to be the background of how you decide whether or not to run in there, or how you decide, whether you should bother trying to help them, or whether it's worth risking your life for it, or whether you should just call the fire department and say, I did my part. That sort of decision-making. And, of course, ethics would also apply in much more mundane circumstance, right? If you're deciding between two careers, then ethics was just, what is the value of going into that? If I choose to spend my life in that career versus this other career, how should I evaluate those options? How should I make that decision? And the failure that Rand is accurately catching by suggesting a different approach is that if you can't explain where the idea of a system for how you should act, or where you can explain why we should have rules behind how we act, you end up with this arbitrariness problem. And so that, I think, in some reason, the very good parts of James' video is that it points out many ethical theories fall into the problem of being fairly arbitrary. As a good example, if you just ask, for instance, to a utilitarian, why should I be ethical? They run into this very serious problem that they can say, because being ethical is what you're supposed to do. But this is, sounds very dangerously circular in that if someone just doesn't care about, quote-unquote, being ethical, utilitarianism cannot account for what actual mistake they're making in their choices, except that they're not ethical. So I think that's very good. I think, secondly, the emphasis on the idea that ethics has to be a scientific, very broadly speaking, inductive, as it were, process of discovering and fleshing out how we ought to make our decisions, that seems very plausible and very good. Now, the challenge to this video is that Ayn Rand's ethical theory is what's called ethical egoism, or also can be called, the idea that selfish action is moral action, with the very obvious premise, I think, to anyone being serious, that selfishness does not mean doing whatever you feel like doing. It means doing what is actually good for you. A very critical distinction for making serious replies. Now, the challenge I see in Rand's meta-ethics is that Rand observes correctly that humans, in a particular fundamental way, are individual creatures that independently survive or die, independently are happy or unhappy, in the sense that there's no magical connection between my well-being and other people's. There is the practical, mechanical interactions, like I want to live in a community that is doing well, I want to have friends who are doing well, but there's not this mystical sense in which we are dependent on each other in a non-practical, mechanical way. And from this, and some other observations I'm trying to keep this video contained, Rand concludes that, rational self-interest is the basis upon which you should make ethical decisions based on the standard of an individual person's life as the standard of value. Now this, for starters, does get around one of the biggest problems with most ethical theories, or at least partially gets around it, which is that if you suggest that, ethics, that you should be self-interested in a rational manner, that's how you should make decisions, and someone says, well, why would I want to do that? You have the rather appealing retort, why would you not want to be happy? And this is a little bit more compelling than in other ethical systems because it seems clear that everyone wants to be well off, they just might want other things more. But it's not like, for instance, the utilitarian problem where if someone asks, why should I be ethical, it's not clear what justification they can give. So that's very interesting. And secondly, it certainly suggests a slightly different category for ethics, in that ethics ends up being a set of instructions we've worked out for how to live based on this identification that your own well-being is the standard of value. So it certainly provides, in practical terms, this provides a foundation to start understanding and deciding on how to act. So that's very good for an ethical theory, that it will form a coherent scientific set of statements about how you should act that generalize and also particularly affect different people in slightly different ways based on their differences. That's all very good. But I think the big challenge is that, and we'll just grant sort of most of Rand's assumptions and her argument. We're granting a lot of the background content she accepts. I think the biggest problem is that the key argument here is that, in my reading, that ethics is as James put it, conditional science, that if you want to flourish, if you want to live well, then ethics is the instructions that just inform you on how to do that. So the problem I see here is not that this is completely arbitrary. It's not just some strange statement of rules put up in the sky. And it's not just people yelling their feelings at each other. It does mean sort of scientifically approach what makes life enjoyable, what makes you well off, what reinforces your health, that sort of thing. So it's not some absurd, arbitrary statement. But the problem I do see is that if you make ethics into a conditional set of instructions, that is, if you want to live well and flourish, then you get this set of instructions we call ethics, I think you run into a particular kind of arbitrariness problem, which is that it's not clear what you say to people who understand what you're saying, but have decided on a different conditional ethical framework. So, for instance, the Randian approach in some sense is to say, if you want to live and flourish, then you should do this. And we'll grant, they have the right ideas there in their own context. The problem, even given that, is if someone else comes up and say, I do like being happy, I do like being well off, but what I decide is that, ethics is, if I want to pursue sort of utilitarian happiness, then I should do this. Or, my priority is, if I want to pursue scientific knowledge being gathered by humanity, then I should do this. Or any other conditional like that, right? Not even getting into sort of nihilistic or very subjective approaches to ethics. Just thinking that people could have other conditional statements that recognize themselves as conditional statements and instructions that follow out of them. I think there's a big issue of leaping the gap between proposing and fleshing out the idea of ethical egoism as a practical set of guidelines if you want to flourish, from the idea that other conditional systems are somehow less fundamentally correct. But the terminology here is very tricky. I think it's an important thing to discuss. I'm not sure, how James might reply here. But that if other people had different conditionals they wanted to adopt, instead of an ethical egoism framework, I'm not sure what the answer is there to justify ethical egoism as the correct ethical theory. So that's the main body of the video. Thank you everyone who's been watching. I hope that stands up on its own as content. I have a little bit more in a minute here. Just a reminder, you can find us here on YouTube or facebook.com/livingreason. I appreciate likes, comments, shares, whatever other social media stuff exists in the world at this point. I don't know. Tell me if I'm not on a platform I should be. I'd appreciate it. So, to finish, as the reply to James' video also is, I hope, some freestanding observations. I think lots of ethical theories end up failing due to what I apologize for not knowing if there's a proper term for this in philosophy, but fail due to what I would call the arbitrariness problem, which is that if you propose the ethical theory and say, this is what ethics is, someone can reply, well, why should I care? Or, what is the point of being ethical or moral, whatever. And in more sophisticated forms of that, of course. And the problem is many ethical systems fail this way, as my friend James Ellias pointed out, because they rely on these sort of floating abstractions that came about due to intuition, right? Like we have this impression that justice is a good thing, which I do think, but we have this impression, and we say, okay, we're going to write justice up on the blackboard, and then we're going to derive what justice implies. That's our plan. And the problem is if someone walks into the room and says, I just don't care about that, so explain why, I have to, or it's ethically, right? This idea of ethics is important if I just don't care about your opinion. That's a very serious problem because it very much defeats the content of ethical theories. I think James correctly points that out. And secondly, that if we want an ethical theory to work, it's going to have to be, in a very broadly defined sense, a scientific theory. That is a theory that takes facts from reality and attempts to extract from them statements about how you should make decisions and how you should act in situations. Those are, I think, the two really good observations. So the biggest sort of concern, critique here, and I hope we have some dialogue here because we are personal friends, I hope we have some dialogue on this one, is that Ayn Rand's ethical theory, in my reading of it and from his video, establishes the idea that ethics is a conditional science, that if you recognize the choice that, you can choose to live as a flourishing, happy person, and you can choose to pursue your own self-interest, then here's the set of instructions we believe follows from that premise. Is that, if we grant the step from A to B, because that's a separate debate from the sort of meta-ethical theory of what ethics is, what does that imply in practice? If you accept the conditional science that if you make this choice to focus on your own flourishing, then ethics is about deriving the set of instructions on how to do that. The problem I see is that this is partially sidestep the arbitrariness problem. It makes it clear to some extent why this isn't just, why you can't just write anything up on the board. You have to sort of explain where your conditional is coming from, what in reality it's coming from. But I think it still perhaps has the problem that if someone else sort of hears your ethical theory, sees your idea of what ethics is, it's not as clear that they can just say, I don't care, because it's sort of awkward to argue that you don't prefer your own happiness to your own unhappiness. But what does seem very awkward is if someone hears your conditional idea and says, well, you can call that ethics, you can call the sort of development of ideas for your own flourishing ethics, but I have my own concept that I call ethics, which is that if you accept the conditional, if you want to encourage the development of universal well-being, then you should do this. Or if you want some other conditional, if you want the conditional, if you want to improve humanity's pursuit of scientific knowledge, then you should do this. I'm not sure the conditional science approach gets us over that kind of gap because you can produce other conditional desires or conditional statements without even going into sort of subjectivist approaches to ethics or nihilistic statements, right? My argument is not that I can claim none of ethics makes sense, therefore this is problematic. My claim is that you have to explain how the egoistic conditional statement is ethics, but the utilitarian conditional statement is not, or the knowledge-driven conditional ethics is not, and so on. So thanks again for the video. As I made a few statements in the middle, there's a lot of big topics in here that I've obviously not covered. I do not think I've refuted utilitarianism in a 20-minute video where I'm briefly commenting on it, things like that. So to any serious philosophers watching, I am not quite that arrogant. But I hope everyone enjoyed the video. I'm hoping to make some more videos, perhaps expanding on particular ideas in this video, or sort of fleshing out points maybe in less of a reply context and just on their own with perhaps a bit more historical or philosophical introduction instead of just sort of talking. Thank you very much to everyone watching. And again, like, share, subscribe. I always take suggestions. You can also find us facebook.com/livingreason, or of course message me through my account. Thank you very much and have a nice day.